why was Jewish nationalism in its various forms more successful in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe? So what are some of your thoughts on that? Why do you think it was an easier sell in East than West?
Well, I think in much of Eastern Europe, it was really more of a nation. It was by force, if nothing else, when you're forced to be separate and keep there's no benefit to adapting at all to the majority culture, like there was in let's say Germany or France, and so you keep your own language because I mean, there might be a little benefit to learning Russian or Polish, but certainly not to the extent of the use of learning French in France. So I think for just people growing up in the different environments, it would have seemed much more natural for most of the Jews in Eastern Europe to see themselves as a nation, while there was really more of another option to those in much of Western Europe, where in a lot of ways, a lot of their culture and their language and the things they did was similar to what their non-Jewish neighbors did. So they didn't feel so nationally separate.
Well, eventually it became that. I mean, they were distinct communities before the opportunity of emancipation. I mean, in Germany, it's different. They become integrated into German culture beginning in the early 19th century, so that by 1870, when they are fully emancipated, they're already sort of fluent and able to circulate in German culture, where in France, it's a little bit ahead of, they're emancipated ahead of that integration process. But certainly by the time of Dreyfus, they're well integrated for sure. Other thoughts?
I think that there's a fairly direct relationship between the advance of the Industrial Revolution and all the cultural changes that take place with it, and the integration of Jews. So in Western Europe, where this is much more advanced, England, France, Germany, Prussia, even Italy, you have the stake of Jews is much higher in the countries in which they live, so they're much less likely to want to feel that they are somehow separate. In Eastern Europe, you still have ghettos very distinctly. You have areas that are the Pale, and the government has not yet opened itself up to complete emancipation. So when you're treated as an alien, it's not hard to sort of consider yourselves as a separate group. When you cease being treated as aliens, then it's easier to do that. So, but there's really a very direct correlation between the advance of the Industrial Revolution and all those changes that went with it.
I mean, that example of the Pale Settlement is a great one because there were no limits on Jews moving to Paris or to Berlin or to London, but Jews could not move to Moscow. They had to get special permission to do so, and into well into the Tsarist period, and they were restricted to certain areas they were allowed to live. So it definitely was an experience of alienation where if we're alienated, we might as well be an alien nation. Like if we're already separate, then that's what we are. And it was a much easier sale. And certainly the stagnant economy led to accepting more radical solutions. In some ways, it's the opposite. We talked previously about the success of the Haskalah and Jewish Enlightenment in Western Europe, precisely because of all these factors that make nationalism an easier sale in Eastern Europe. So looking at our next question, why were Jews, especially in Eastern Europe and America for that matter, attracted to socialism? And is there anything from this tradition that still inspires secular humanistic Jews?
Well, I'll go. I think it's twofold. I mean, one, I think it was probably much more common among working class, poorer Jews.
Which was the mass of Jews.
Yeah. So when you have a bunch of those, you're more likely to be attracted to socialism, which says, this isn't, ordained by God that you be, lowly serfs and serve the rich people. You deserve more. And if you join with us, we're going to demand it and get it. And then also there are parts of Jewish tradition that are sort of socialist adjacent, definitely not full on socialism, but requirements of rather than in a lot of Christian stuff, charity is voluntary and it's an act of the heart. Jewish law and socialism has a bit more of the legal spreading. You know, there's the requirement that you leave the corners of your field for the widow and stuff, and so that you could connect that with even if you weren't religious, you know, maybe you've heard the stories when you were growing up and listening to the local rabbi talk or whatever. There were a few.
I'm sorry, were you going to finish up?
Yeah, I was just adding, like, you know, there were a few sort of similarities of taking care of one another in a more structured way. You had the organizations of mutual aid societies and stuff that all have a kind of tie into a similar way of thinking.
Okay, so certainly a collectivist experience rather than pure individualist solutions. I mean, you did have the Catholic concept of tithing. It's not that, you know, there wasn't a kind of sense of requirements or paying for indulgences, you know. I mean,
but that was to the church. That wasn't to the poor. Very different.
Yes, that's true. And the church was expected to take care of the poor. I mean, you had a tzedakah fund. You know, it wasn't only that you were giving directly to the poor. Often you had charity soups and, you know, and organizations like that. But you know, the question about the role of Jewish culture in the attraction of Jewish socialism, I find fascinating because it's really hard to tease out what is an actual inheritance. Like, I read the book of Isaiah and all of a sudden I saw this stuff about breaking the yoke of suffering and I became a socialist. I don't know that people do that, you know, and there's lots of people who read Isaiah who don't become socialists. So I'm not sure that it's a direct line inheritance. Now, let's say you are a socialist from reading Marx and from reading Engels and from reading Kropotkin and whoever else you read, and from your experience as a social in a union or working in a factory, you become a socialist. Now you look back to your Jewish heritage and tradition, and you look for the things that resonate with you out of that you want to emphasize. And so you might say, Passover, what a great holiday. You've got workers fighting against the bosses, and it's like perfect. Yom Kippur, with like praying to God for forgiving our individual sins. Go on and do some more work. Like, let's do something more practical. So you might have chosen some things and rejected other things. There's a famous example of this that I talk about a bit in our Roots class that's on the YouTube channel already, where a secular Jewish school, a Bund school, was listing the holidays that their school should study and celebrate. And they include Passover, and they include May Day. They don't include Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, because those were religious holidays. They don't even include Sukkot, because that's a farming holiday and we're the urban proletariat. What does that have to do with us? So they went back and chose from their inheritance what resonated for them. It wasn't necessarily, look, there's a reason why the people who are studying this over and over again in the ultra-Orthodox world don't become socialists, right? They don't evolve in that direction, but they do have aspects of what a socialist might find attractive in the mutual aid societies, the free loan societies, all kinds of other mutual support initiatives. I just find it really tough to tease out directly, like, I was raised in a shtetl and therefore I became a socialist. It doesn't automatically happen.
And I want to be clear, I wasn't trying to say that direct line.
Right. I agree.
It's one of those, you have a whole bunch of things, but some of those that they all pile together to make you like go one way or the other. And it can be useful having those things as part of the pile to push you over in one way or the other.
Right. Yeah, Laurie, go ahead.
I have to really disagree. I'm sorry. If you look at the broader movement of socialism in the late 19th century, this is an idealistic, movement by the working class, of which the Jews form a large part, within places like Russia and Poland, and they are being swept along by the populist movement of the socialist ideas at that time. The fact that they would turn out to be completely unrealistic and it would not ever work. They looked upon the bosses. I mean, I don't think there's anything particularly Jewish about this. I think this is particularly an economic and social movement that is growing in Eastern Europe at this particular, and not just Eastern Europe, at this particular time. The Internationale is yes, you can turn around and say, oh yeah, we can find these things in our heritage, but I don't don't think that's very important. I become a socialist because I don't like capitalists. I agree with this ideology they've been reading. The students have come out into the countryside to preach to us in the 1870s in Russia. And we think that, and this is a way for us who are downtrodden people to gain some power, which is why other working class people do the same thing. Unfortunately for the Jews, they discovered for the most part that they were still Jews, and that all the rest of the people didn't accept them, as like part of the working class struggle, because, well, they were still Jews. And that's part of the problem that somebody like, that the intelligentsia is seeing. The great disappointment after the Russian Revolution was the fact that, hey, you know what, we participated in all this, and we supported you, and like, yeah, too bad. Because Stalin was very anti-Semitic.
Yeah, well, and look, under Lenin too, there were periods of persecution of distinct Jewish identities. There were a few options of doing Jewishness the Soviet-approved way.
Yeah,
but the Bund wasn't included.
They were anti-religious in general, anyway. I mean,
right.
So if you're going to be anti-Russian church, you're certainly going to be anti,
right. But they even went to the extent of rewriting the Yiddish language to eliminate any trace of Hebrew in it, where, in Yiddish, you often have words that are adapted into Hebrew.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, from Hebrew into Yiddish.
Yeah.
But they would change the way it was written, so you couldn't even tell it was originally a Hebrew word. Where in Yiddish, you would have it written in the old Hebrew way, you just know to pronounce it Shabbos or emes, which means the truth. But they would, instead of writing it Aleph Mem Tav in the Hebrew way, and you just know this is emes, because that's how you read that word, they would actually write it Ayin Mem, Ayin Samech, so that you would read it as emes, like phonetically. That's how they wanted to purge Hebrew from Yiddish, because it was religious and because it was bourgeois nationalist, aka Zionist. So,
or were they really just the people who had trouble with words not being spelled phonetically? Because I understand that too.
Yeah, but like in English, I know, but in English we're used to that too. But it was also an attempt, by the way, to cut them off from their historic culture, because you can't read Shalom Aleichem without, because he's writing it in that old Yiddish with the Hebrew as part of it. You couldn't be Yiddish literate without knowing some Hebrew. There was always some required, but they tried to change that. So anyway, I agree with you that there's a challenge to claiming this as an organic process. But let me give you a parallel from the 20th century. Jewish feminism did not happen in a vacuum. And it did not happen organically, purely from studying the Talmud over and over again. It happened in the context of American feminism, of world feminism, of 20th century feminism, of different waves of feminism. And the kind of reforms that Jewish women began pushing for in the late 60s and early 70s were echoes of the reforms women have been pushing for in the late 50s and 60s. And they said, I can do all these things out there, and look, and I go back to the synagogue, and I have to sit in the back of the room, and I can't be a rabbi, and I can't count as a witness. And there's all these disabilities that I have. I don't count for the minyan. I'm not part of the minimum quorum to pray, when I might know more Hebrew than that ignoramus you bring in as the 10th man. So they begin advocating for themselves in Jewish life as a result of what's happening in the outside world. Now, do they look for sources in Jewish tradition? Do they look at Ruth and they look at Miriam and they find Beruria, who was the wife of a rabbi who was learned? And of course they do. But it doesn't mean that it's an organic upswing from traditional Jewish sources. It's the human experience of exclusion, because Henrietta Zold was trying to get admitted to the rabbinic program at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1905, or in the early part and was told no. So that impulse was there. That's a human experience. So the socialism could come from the human experience of being a worker. It could come from the surrounding cultural moment. And then maybe you look back and try to find the sources that work for you. But it is true that certain cultural groups might be more disposed towards certain kind of radical political solutions. Rather than pure anarchism, let's say, a kind of structured socialism might be more attractive because of that Jewish experience. So again, teasing out those lines can be really tricky. In terms of what kind of inspiration might we find today? Well, there are certainly secular humanistic Jews today who would identify as socialists, certainly more probably in the last 5 years than what might have done so 20 or 30 years ago. But the idealism is valuable. The successes that took place is important. The attachment to both a distinct ethnic identity as a Yiddishist Jew or a socialist Jew, while also being committed to social justice for all peoples, is exactly the kind of balancing act that we try to maintain, where we can advocate for our people while having an eye out for the justice of all people. So we can find some interesting parallels to that in the modern moment as well. Okay, moving on. How do the goals of Yiddish nationalism differ from Zionism, and how are they similar? So first, let's think about what are some of the similarities between this Jewish socialism, Yiddish nationalism, and Zionism.
Well, they both wanted national rights in a way. They wanted other nations to treat them as a group with national rights on par with the rights that the other groups were getting. You know, the Yiddishists, they wanted to be able to use their own language and have a measure of self-determination. The Zionists, they wanted to be able to speak not Yiddish, but Hebrew, but had their own language. They didn't want to have other groups pushing their own cultures really on them. They wanted to have the freedom and some autonomy to be their own group, nation, however you want to define it. I'm clear they're defining it as nation there, but nation's a fuzzy word.
Right, right. I mean, they didn't want to be the victims of history. They wanted to be the authors of history. They wanted to be acting in the world the way nations act, not as this, sideshow that is acted upon by other people. Some other similarities. They both saw the Jews as an ethnic group and not as a religious idea, a religious denomination or a set of beliefs and ritual practices. They both wanted mass solutions. They were not interested in just an elite integrationist solution that only works if you can go to college. They wanted to solve it for the working classes, for people, that weren't necessarily aspiring to beyond the basic education. And they both agreed that integration into European societies was not the ultimate goal. The Yiddishists wanted to stay there and get their respect as their own separate cultural group, while the Zionists said we're giving up on it and we're willing to leave. But they both insisted that integration, the reform model, the just become a German of the Mosaic Faith, they're just a German who's secular, wasn't a successful approach. And honestly, there was a strong socialist strain in both of these movements. The strongest department, let's say, of the World Zionist Organization was labor Zionism. It's actually kind of sad to see where the Labor Party is today in Israel, given that history. But the founders of the state were, predominantly part of this labor Zionist stream. And of course, Jewish socialism was socialist oriented as well. And they were both very culturally active. They had, youth movements and camps. In fact, many of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion in 1943 had come out of varieties of Zionist youth movements. And it took them a while to agree across the revisionist and the labor Zionist lines. They still hated each other, right? Just like the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front. But ultimately, they cooperated in some kind of resistance organization. But it was the youth movements that provided the energy. Mordechai Yankelevitz, who led the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion, was a product of the Hashomer Hatzair youth movement. That cultural activity was something it was, again, a substitute for the religious community. They created a secular community of this activist group. Now, why were they different? Well, Hebrew versus Yiddish, stay versus move. In fact, the Bund was sometimes made fun of in the Communist International. They were called Zionists with seasickness, meaning they wanted all the rights of national identity, but were afraid to move. So they were like stealth bourgeois nationalists because they insisted on specific Jewish things. But in any case, stay or move. And is cultural autonomy enough, or do you need full political sovereignty? That was really the core debate, where the Zionists felt you couldn't have pure cultural autonomy unless you had a political sovereignty that was your own. And the Yiddishists were hopeful that under a multi-ethnic empire like the Austro-Hungarian or Russian empires, they could carve out a space along with other ethnic groups as a respected and tolerated minority. with the right to use their own language and so on. So the fourth question, how does Jewish nationalism differ from Reform Judaism or Haskalah on that question? Well, we sort of talked about this, that, is it a nation or is it a religion? Many of the nationalists were actually anti-religious, or at least non-religious. And we still have this discussion today. A lot of people out there think of being Jewish as a religious identity. It's my religion. Or the only way to be Jewish is to do it religiously. And if you try to do it in a more secular, cultural, non-theistic approach, as we do, it's not treated as legitimate or as part of the spectrum of Jewish identity. I mean, there were times early on in our movement where our communities couldn't even get listed in the synagogue's listings in the local Jewish paper because they felt that it was, we didn't fit in that category. So we're much better on that front than we were 50 years ago when we started, but we're still deal with that from time to time. Okay, and then number 5, how did Theodor Herzl see Zionism as the solution to anti-Semitism in Europe? And was he right or not?
Well, I mean, his solution was to create a state that Jews could go to and remove themselves from the areas where there was anti-Semitism. But that's not necessarily, I mean, it's unrealistic to expect all the Jews in the world to move to Palestine. And so the problem is that by creating a state, you created this sense of dual loyalties for Jews, even though they themselves aren't saying that. I'm an American, but people come around and says, yes, but you do stuff for Israel first, and then America second. And even though it's not true, that's always there behind line. So that's the danger of that situation.
Well, and keep in mind, the first attempt to rename things because of a conflict was World War I, where sauerkraut became victory cabbage because people couldn't stand Germans.
Yeah.
And Wiener Schnitzel or victory sausage. Freedom fries is just the latest incarnation of this trend. So, yeah, I mean, that question of dual loyalty was certainly a challenge. You don't need Jews to have anti-Semitism, by the way.
No.
If you have a global conspiracy, you don't need the people nearby to be a villain for you. And the thought was, from Herzl's perspective, that if you didn't have Jews there as a provocation, you wouldn't have anti-Semitism. But it's so deeply rooted that it's hard to eradicate. There's a very interesting book written by a University of Chicago professor. I do not recommend you read it because it is 500 pages of very dense academic work. I found it really interesting, but it was hard going. And the title is called Anti-Semitism, the Western Tradition, because he traces it through Western thought all the way into modern times, how deeply rooted the idea of the Jew as the other, as the evil, as the bad example is threaded through as a common theme. And Herzl was a little naive about that. And he even thought the Europeans would help, get the Jews out of Europe because they don't want them here either. So they'll help us move. They'll be happy to work with us and get us out of there.
They just, this is Joel, they just traded one for another. I mean, clearly, by the time they ended up creating Israel, I mean, they were surrounded by people who hated them. Right.
And we'll talk more about that and the dynamic with colonialism and so on as well, which is part of the resentment of the Arabs is they see the Jews see themselves as coming back to a homeland, but the Arabs see them as Europeans coming in to colonize them. And in the era of decolonization, I mean, all the colonies start getting turned over to the native populations starting after World War II in the 1940s. There used to be a UN commission on decolonization, which was designed to help countries sort of get their feet under them and move on. And they had these two maps they would share. One was the world in 1945, and one proportion of the map was owned by European powers between the Dutch and East Indies and the British in India and the French in Vietnam and all over Africa and so on. And they finally closed up shop in the 1990s because almost all the countries had become independent. And it is true, by the way, The sun still does not set on the British Empire. They have enough islands here and there with the Falklands and Malta and whatever, that you can still say the sun doesn't set, but it's a fraction of what it was, in 1945.
And that's why they won't give those islands up.
Hell no. Those sheep are ours. So in the end, the hope was that Zionism would solve the anti-Semitism issue. It certainly hasn't, and in some cases it has exacerbated it. So looking at the last question, what were some of the accomplishments of the early Zionist movement and some of its miscalculations? Well, I'll give you an overview and then we'll open up for your thoughts. I mean, they did actually build cities. They built these agricultural settlements. They did move thousands of Jews into this territory. They reestablished the modern Hebrew language as a spoken language by focusing on the kindergartners and the kids and getting them to speak it growing up because of the fervor of their ideology. The joke was, it used to be that everybody spoke Hebrew in university and Yiddish on the street. But nowadays in Israel, the secular population speaks Hebrew on the street and only learns Yiddish in university. But that's a big change. They have revolutionized a sense of Jewishness in history. The idea is that Jews do fight back, that there is a price to pay for Jewish blood, as they would say. That is something that is understood, and it is a change from the past. It has provided a refuge for Jews fleeing from persecution from many other countries, absolutely. It inspired Jews worldwide to maintain a Jewish connection. Supposedly the two pillars of secular Jewish identity in America were the Holocaust and support for the state of Israel through the 20th century. Again, those consensuses are sort of breaking down, but it was definitely a very powerful force for Jewish unity. And ultimately, if the goal of the Zionist movement was to make a state, they made a state. Like, that's goal 1A was achieved, right? Now, miscalculations, a few. One of the slogans that was popular early on echoes something Laurie was saying about what happened in South Africa with the Boer. The slogan was, "A people without land for a land without people." There's nobody there, so we can just go and fill it up. Well, there were people there. They just weren't considered full people by Europeans. And so we understand the problems with that. They predicted the end of anti-Semitism. We know that didn't happen. They thought all Jews would wind up moving there, either by choice or expulsion, while there are still tens of thousands of Jews living by choice in other communities all over the world, whether it's in cities in North America or in Argentina, in South America, in Australia, in parts of Europe still. There are still 500,000 Jews living in France. So this was not something the Zionists anticipated there'd be a large Jewish population outside. And in a particular sub-mistake, thinking that small-scale agricultural socialism would be the solution for the masses never really succeeded. At any one time, the maximum of the population of the Jewish settlement that was actually on a kibbutz or a moshav, a collective farm, with a little more privacy, was something like 15%, maybe 20% at the most. It was never even close to a majority. Most Jews lived in the cities or small towns because Jews were urban. We saw that in Europe, and they moved to Israel, and they might have landed on a kibbutz and said, "What am I doing here?" And it's what I call the romance of manure. At a certain point, you think manure is a great idea, and then you have to work with it with your hands, and then you say, "I'm going back to books. I'm going back to the city with transportation and sanitation," and that's where I'm more comfortable.
Rural areas are a place to visit on your vacation, and then you go back to civilization.
There you go. Exactly. So, any of your thoughts on either accomplishments of the Zionist movement or some of its miscalculations?
I may be getting ahead, and you can knock me down if you want, but I think perhaps one of the biggest miscalculations they made was to ignore the Arab population, and to buy land that Arab tenant farmers had been working from absentee landowners, thus creating people that became a landless group. And ultimately, what happens in response to the Zionist movement in Palestine is the creation of a Palestinian group of people that had not considered themselves as a separate group of people before. And they became a group called Palestinians. And that they kind of, I mean, I don't know how they might have avoided this. I mean, it's very complicated because you want to get land, and who owns the land? Ottoman landowners, or, you know, so, and this was part of the problem. But they also tended to not offer jobs very often to the Arabs that lived around them. There's a lot of this stuff.
Well, remember, part of their ideology was Jewish labor. It's the Labor Party. They wanted Jews to work with their hands. So it wasn't just that they were buying the land and then have the tenant farmers keep working on it. They were buying the land and they wanted Jews to work on it. And hiring Arab labor was actually seen as a betrayal of the ideology.
It's a bougie move.
Definitely bougie, very bougie.
Yeah, but what it did was it created a tremendous amount of resentment, obviously, which was then exploited by people like the Grand Mufti and so forth. I mean, again, I don't want to get way ahead into the history here, but it's very complicated, but it's really hard to try to build something in a place where there's not very many of you to begin with, and you want to bring a lot of people in. They got to go somewhere. Someone else is going to get kicked out, and that's going to create resentment by those folks.
Right. I mean, look, the Serbs are still pissed at the Kosovo Albanians for a defeat in 1347 or whatever, you know, whatever that happened. They're still mad about that. So
well, you know, it's from Member Bannockburn, you know, the Scots.
Freedom. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I gotta say, I really agree with Lori. I think that there was not enough thought put into really the consequences of various actions towards that involved the local Arab population that caused a lot of trouble down the road. And I mean, I can sort of understand, especially from a lot of them coming from really oppressed areas of Europe. You're not necessarily thinking about you. You're not worrying about you being an oppressor. That's never been something you've ever had to worry about. So
I will say, though, that the early Zionist movement was not as blind to this as people sometimes think. You can find stuff that people are writing about. What are we doing coming here and becoming the colonialists and becoming the oppressors that we said we weren't going to be, and thinking about the challenges of what to do with the Arabs. But in the end, the Yishuv settled on honestly in a point of agreement between the Labor Party and the revisionists, which was, we need a state. The Jews need a state. And if push comes to shove, then we're going to do it here. And if they have to lose out, then they're going to lose out. And, you know, it was a zero-sum game and they weren't going to lose. And sometimes they also thought of it as, they thought of Arab nationalism in their own image. You know, Jewish nationalism in theory included Yemeni Jews and Syrian Jews and Yiddish-speaking Jews, but Arab identity was often clan and tribe and region. I heard an anecdote once. They were trying to do a Palestinian national conference and they wanted to do a demo wedding at the conference, but they couldn't agree on what to do for the wedding, because a wedding in Galilee is different from a wedding in Gaza, which is different from a wedding in Jaffa. You know, they're very different because it was regional more than, you know, known by the city or by the, you know, the Pasha's district or whatever, than by a national identity. So the Jews said, well, look, we want one Jewish state. You just go live in another Arab state because you're all Arabs.
Well, there weren't Arab states. I mean,
I know that. I'm saying that the Zionist movement is projecting their national identity concept on the Arab populations that aren't thinking in those terms. And so they're tied to the land where the Jews say, look, hey, we move all the time. Why don't you guys move? They've been there for generations.
I think there's also, from some of the major leaders, though, especially, who, despite themselves, were somewhat assimilated into the cultures in which they were now rejecting. But let's face it, Herzl was hardly an oppressed peasant somewhere in Russia. And they came in with the very same European racial ideas that the colonialists did, and the Arabs were not high on the racial list. So, I mean, that's just the reality of it.
Right. I mean, there's even, if you read, as we'll look at next time, the Israeli Declaration of Independence, there's a phrase that could be lifted directly from the concept of white man's burden, where it says they brought the blessings of progress to all the inhabitants. And you read it now and you think, that reads very differently. than it might have when they wrote it in 1948. And we'll talk about that in a future class.